Welcome back. It's always encouraging to me if I look in the camera here and see myself and actually think that, hey, maybe, just maybe, somebody decided to try me one more time, see if I could make it. And so I'm going to try one more time and see if I can make it. Actually, I'm not going to give up even at that. I believe that what I'm doing, and I don't claim it to be just me, because I think I receive divine help with this, but I believe that what's going on here is bigger than maybe me or even this time period. I really wonder if this will make it even through the eternities, maybe, and be able to be saved for somebody's benefit. I'm not sure whose. I hope my great and keep going greats grandchildren will be able to see this. Not so much me, but maybe at least connect a pace with the voice and get some benefit from it that will make their lives easier and keep them from having as many problems as they might otherwise have. I ought to mention that I've noticed that as I do these, sometimes I'll look in my mustache. It looks like there's something dripping down over my mustache, and you may have seen me even reach up with one hand like this and try to fix it a little bit or whatever. Well, one of these days I'll tell you a story about the mustache. But for now, just know that I have discovered that it's a shadow and not something real and gunky and gooey and all that stuff. So don't preoccupy yourself with it, I guess. Stay focused on the word. The last time I posted something, ended up calling it "How About a Hand Up?" And if you remember correctly, that was the one where I told you different ways to use your hands to help you remember things that were quite vitally important. And I'm not going to repeat that lesson right now. However, there may be a time in the future when I'll review it, because I'd actually kind of like it to be a standalone, and maybe somebody could pass it on to somebody else as just a standalone commentary on how I can use my hands to profit me some way. It's been an interesting day today. I've had some experience that have been out of the ordinary, should we say. My wife and I took a little trip, and long story short, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about that, because that's not the direction I want this to go this time. However, it has kind of confirmed that those things that I have been postponing for a little bit, I may need to grasp and pick up and should we say, reestablish on that base rock we've been talking about. And I can tie it into the hand thing too, but I'm not going to keep doing that over and over. I think I'll start out by doing this, by telling you I've been rehearsing things that have gone on in my life, and tried to let you know how I've come to learn some things. And I can't repeat everything, but just to give you an idea, maybe in these earlier podcasts, these uploads, that I think the experiences I've had early in my life, be they positive experiences or experiences that I would have interpreted at the time to be negative experiences, have actually, surprise, turned out to be the kind of experiences that I could recall later on actually make some sense out of now that I couldn't make sense of then very well, or at least not as well, because I didn't understand as much. And yet those experiences were actually part of the things that helped me to understand what I understand today as an old man. I keep saying I'm an old man. And one of these days I'll convince you, even if you're not convinced already, which you probably are. But I've told you that I grew up on a dairy farm, and I count that as a blessing. And yet I'm convinced that other people could grow up in different settings and, under the Lord's guidance, could have similar kinds of experiences in different settings that would teach some of the same truths, because I think He cares about all of us, not just the ones that grow up on dairy farms. So, got to be on the aware. And this is why I say, rather than say why me about some things, say what can I learn from this? And if you take that approach, life gets better. I found that out. Life gets better if you take the what can I learn from this approach rather than the why me approach. That's a definite approach that will benefit you. All right, so I grew up on a dairy farm, as I was saying, and I'm going to recall an incident that happened. It must have been a Saturday afternoon. I'm guessing, if I had to guess, I'd say it was in the spring of the year. I don't remember there being snow on the ground. It was probably late spring on a Saturday. I was with my cousin who lived a quarter of a mile down the road. And in farm community terms, a quarter of a mile down the road meant your next door neighbor. I realize now, living here in the city, that a quarter of a mile down the road would take in quite a few houses. But back on the farm, a quarter of a mile was about as close as anybody got to each other. Sometimes it's longer than that. So my cousin, a quarter mile down the road, was up with me to my house, and we didn't like sticking around the house that much. And we were out looking for a little bench, and we went down near the barn, and I don't know, you just have to kind of create your own activities and see where they'll take you. And we had some nice games that we'd invent all by ourselves, and sometimes they involved, find some eggs in an old stackyard and see who could knock the bucket off the post. And there's all kinds of games you can create when you're on the farm. Well, this particularly Saturday morning, I was there with my cousin, and we were, as much as it can apply to farm kids, we were, should I say, bored. And we were, I can remember we were off in one end of the barn, and there was kind of a separate room back there. And we were just a little restless, not particularly focused on anything that we wanted to do. I forget who it was. It was either he or I that had reached over and got a little chunk of wood on the floor, and we just chucked it. Well, lo and behold, it went over and kind of by a corner of the barn, and it caused a little disturbance over there in the corner with 3 chickens that were in the barn with us, and they kind of fluttered and carried on, and we thought that was pretty funny that a chicken would carry on like that just over a little chunk of wood that you threw in their general direction. And so we got some. It so happened there was a little pile of this wood. I'm not sure what the wood was there for, but it wasn't. I said it was piled. It wasn't really piled. It was kind of scattered around in one part of the barn, and I don't recall why it was there, because that's not a normal place for the. It's just old barn wood and scraps. I don't know whether it was being saved for, a branding fire maybe, or something like that. So after we threw that one chunk of wood over the chickens and noticed how they reacted, we thought, we're onto something here. This could be exciting. So we got another piece and checked it over in the same direction. And they did the same thing, only maybe a little more. And they'd fly up in the air a couple of feet and come back down, start clocking and carrying on. And we were both at that time had a piece of wood in our hands, and we both threw them at the same time. And some chickens went one way and some chickens went the other. And there was a little manger there they'd fly up on occasionally. And then they'd come back out and they'd be clucking and carrying on. And it was getting kind of fun. I mean, not fun from the perspective of the chickens, of course, because those chickens were about to meet a sad demise. By the time we got done chucking things around the barn, we had killed all 3 chickens. I'm not sure how you do that, but all 3 of those chickens were dead. I guess we'd hit them in the head and just kept going and weren't thinking and just enjoying ourselves until we realized, hold on, there's no more chickens flying around, and we got looking at them, they're all dead. Well, you're probably thinking, and you were a bad boy. And guess what? I was. But this is where I want the story to kind of kick in. Because once they were dead, my cousin and I just stood there and kind of looked at each other like, oh my, what have we done? And it just sunk into us that we had now, there's nothing we could do to bring it back to life. And they were dead, and there was going to be some consequences. We just knew it. Well, it's interesting to me how, and it's been my experience, that when you do something wrong, now if you get the adversary involved in this, I'm talking Satan himself, you get the adversary involved in something and he leads you down a path and gets you doing something wrong, gets you to perform the way he wants you to perform. Remember, we had a whole lesson on opposition from 2 Nephi, chapter 2. Anyway, if he can get you to do something he wants you to do, pretty soon, it can seem fun at the time. But then all of a sudden, the reality sets in, and guess what? Satan's not going to cover your hind end. And guess what? Who else isn't going to cover my hind end in this case? My cousin, because he went out the window and went running home just as soon as it happened. Off he went. And anyway, I just remember sitting there and wondering, now what? I've been abandoned. It was fun. It's not fun anymore. And the stark reality of what had gone on just seemed to settle over me like a big, wet, heavy blanket. It just felt awful. I knew there was going to be a consequence. And I couldn't think of what I was going to do to avoid it. Now, keep in mind, it was a Saturday, so my dad wasn't working. He and my mother were up at the house. There I am standing over 3 dead chickens, wondering what in the world's going to happen. And I finally came to grips with it after this wet, heavy blanket. And sometimes I found out this wet, heavy blanket, depending on what you're doing in life and what mistakes you've made. Sometimes that wet, heavy blanket can just hang on. It's like you can't get it off. It stays there, and it stays there. And anyway, I was feeling heavy enough, and and there was no real blanket there, but the feeling was, I don't know how else to describe it. It was not a good feeling. And I've already talked to you about good feelings and bad feelings and where they come from. Bad feelings come from the opposition. And this is all borne out in Scripture too. Bad feelings come from the opposition, the adversary. Good feelings come from Christ and following the promptings that he gives us, which in this case, the prompting didn't come. And so I obviously just ignored it, and that says something about me, because if the prompting didn't come, that says I was beyond prompting, I guess. But as I sat there, lo and behold, I did get a prompting. And it was a prompting, I believe, that was designed to help me get rid of this heavy, depressive, wet blanket of guilt, we'll say. This blanket of guilt that came over me. And you may have felt that in various areas of your life, after different events. If you haven't, I'd be surprised. Maybe the blanket gets heavier with some things than it does others, and maybe earlier on it doesn't seem to settle in as much, but after we know better, which I came to realize if I didn't know better, I should have. I wasn't that young. I had been taught right from wrong, and I'd gotten caught up in something that was wrong before I even realized it. 3 dead chickens later, there I was with this heavy, wet blanket, and now finally, I get the bell. I get the prompt. I get the message, and here's the message. The message is, you've got to make this right. What you did was wrong. The only way you're going to get started is to go up to your mother and dad and tell them exactly what you've done and that you're sorry about it. Well, that's a pretty heavy pill to swallow. For me, it was. Are you serious? I've got to go up to mom and dad and look them in the eye and tell them? And the answer just kept coming back. Yes, that's what you got to do. Down on the farm, we called it grabbing the bull by the horns. In other words, face to face to what was confronting you and charging at you, and just deal with it. Well, I could feel trouble charging at me. It was a bad feeling. And yet, I, for the life of me, couldn't think of anything or any way that I could get out of this. It was like, I've got to own up to it. Now, here's what happened. Because the adversary wasn't done with me yet, I found out. But I did go up to the house. And on my way up to the house, I heard that adversarial voice telling me, yeah, you go ahead and tell them what happened to those chickens. Go ahead. You tell them, and you just know that bad things are going to happen as soon as you tell them. And if you tell them, there's going to be hell to pay, so to speak. And maybe that's the wrong terminology here, because that's not the way the adversary would have said it, but there is going to be trouble. And you're going to face consequences that the like of which you've never faced before. And the trepidation, the fear started to set in as I was getting closer and closer into the house. But I kept putting one foot in front of the other and getting closer and closer. I can remember going in through the back door into what they called the kitchen area. And I opened the door very, very timidly, just wondering if I should change my mind and run the other direction. But again, something said, go on in. But by this time, the adversary had told me this. He had told me a lie. He told me, you can come up with a story. In other words, you can lie also. Because think about it, there was a calf down there in that same barn. And maybe that calf, you could convince your parents that maybe that calf got loosed and kicked all those chickens in the head while it was running around the barn, feeling its oats. Maybe that calf just kicked up its heels and killed all those chickens, those 3 chickens. Well, you can kind of tell how young I was because I bought into that plan. If I'd been a little older, I think I would have discarded that one in a hurry as anybody that's been around calves and chickens know that that's not even a possibility. But in my mind, it was a possibility. Can you see how the adversary works? In my mind, there's a way out of this. You don't have to cave right in that fast and clean yourself up. You can get out of this. So I actually listened a little more at the door, and I could hear some voices in there. It wasn't coming from the kitchen, but I could tell there was somebody in the house talking to my parents in the living room area. So I got enough bravery in my soul that I decided, okay, it's now or never. And I opened the door and walked inside. I'd have liked to have had a camera of myself because I swear my knees were shaking. You heard about that. Well, if it wasn't actual, it sure felt like my knees were shaking because I just stood there and kind of trembled, not just with my knees, but my whole body seemed to just tremble at the thought of what I was going to have to do. And there I was, right on the threshold of doing it, and I just worked myself into almost a frenzy. Well, the sad part about it is, maybe this was part of the whole experience for me. The sad part about it is I stand there and wait for that conversation in the living room to get done. And so I found myself thinking about it and rehearsing everything and deciding, okay, I'm going to present it like this. And I bought into this plan of the calf kicking him in the head. And I had to make it sound real. And I had to put feeling into the way I told it. And I had planned it all out while they were in there talking, and I was out in the kitchen shaking. Well, I don't want to take too long to tell this story, but really you have to know some of that to appreciate what I was going through, because it was not pleasant. Sin isn't pleasant. And coming out from under it, that wet blanket that it throws over you, is not pleasant. And it takes a while sometimes to realize it. But the conversation in the other room finally ended, and I can't even remember who it was, but they left and went out through the porch area of our house. And my parents were still in the living room, and finally I went over to the corner of the living room door, and I just told them, I says, I think it was my mom I approached first. I says, can you come out here for a minute? And I can just imagine what my little voice sounded like. Can you come out here for a minute? Yeah, kind of like that. Anyway, sure enough, she came out, and I said, I've got something I need to tell you. And at that point, she could tell something was kind of wrong. And I remember, I think she pulled over a chair and got down kind of on my eye level. And she said, okay, which was my indication. Go ahead. And so Dad wasn't there yet. He was still in the living room, but I thought, okay, I'm going to tell her. And all about how he went down to the barn, and while I was at the barn, and I went into the other room where the calf was, and the calf was, I even told her the calf was in the room, which it wasn't. It was in another part of the barn. But I lied again. I mean, that's the thing about the way Satan works, is if he can get you to do one thing and then tell you there's a way out without fessing up, and then he can get you to lie. That's a pretty easy step for him, I have found out. He can get you to lie, and then pretty soon you're lying about the lie. It's a vicious thing. Well, back to the story. So I looked at my mom and I explained, there's something I got to tell you. There's these chickens down the barn, and there's this calf. And about that time, my dad walked into the kitchen and stood there, and he could tell I was telling this story. And he didn't say anything. He just listened in. And I said, and I think I know. I think I know what happened. If you think about it, that calf was there. I'm pretty sure that calf got feeling frisky, and anyway, I noticed some dead chickens and that calf, and I know that calf was the one that kicked those chickens in the head and killed them, because they're all dead. 3 dead chickens that calf kicked in the head. Now, maybe I even got you chuckling a little bit at that story, because like I said, if you know calves and chickens, you know that was a foolish story to tell and get somebody to believe. And especially now my dad had come in the room. Because the next thing that happened is my mom looked up at my dad, and my dad looked down at my mom. And then they both looked at me. And guess what I did? I just burst into tears. And I just wept and wept and wept, and I couldn't control it. And I felt so bad, and I was in that situation, and the whole world was caving in on me. Good grief. I didn't know what I was going to do, and I'd done my best to try to tell them how those chickens died, and they didn't believe it. The reason I know they didn't believe it, because as soon as I told them after my dad had got in there, they looked at each other, and then they looked at me, and then they looked at each other again. And anyway, and I was sobbing, and I looked up through my tears, and I guess I should have been kind of relieved, because my dad got this kind of grin on his face. It wasn't a big grin, but it was like, whoa, whoa, little boy. You got yourself into some real trouble. You expect me to believe that story? And he didn't say it. He didn't say, I don't believe your story. But he just smiled. And then my mom kind of smiled. And they reached over, and like I said, I was sobbing. I finally came to the end of my sobs, and they reached over. First, my mom. My mom was always the first on these kind of things, but she kind of put her arm around me and could see, without me even having to tell her what had happened, that I'd made up a false story and that I'd killed them myself. And she put her arm around me, and then my dad kind of stood at the back of me, and he put his hands on my shoulders. Kind of gave me a little squeeze, as I remember it. And they never did talk about it after that. Somehow, I felt that I was missing something. I felt like I should have been able to get right down there and come clean. There's something in me that wanted to come clean. I wanted to tell him, yeah, my cousin and I were down there and we got roughhousing, and the next thing we knew, we threw a stick and it scared the chickens. Once we found out that it worked, we started throwing more sticks and we hit them all till they died. I just wanted to get it off and do it right. Somehow they knew they didn't have to take me to that point. And I think somehow they knew that the point would get driven home even better if they let me dwell on it a little bit more and come to grips with it. Anyway, they said, go outside and play. They thought my cousin was still out there, even though he was long gone, just like the adversary is. Gets you in trouble and then heads for the exit door. Yeah, he went out the window and ran all the way home. That's the other thing that I found is don't expect a lot of support when there's that kind of thing going on, because the only way you can really fess up to it is to take it, like I said, bull by the horns and deal with it. Well, they left. Now, it wasn't until, I would guess, 3 weeks later. So it was kind of still on my mind about coming all the way clean. 3 weeks later, and I had let that fester, and it still festered. And I can remember them. This time they were down at the barn, and we just got the cows in, and we were getting ready to milk, but there was some delay for some reason, and they were there, and I just told them. I said, you remember that story I told you? Well, my cousin, and I named him, I won't name him here, but we got thrown these little boards over there, and actually that's how the cows died. And I can remember, again, they were both together for some reason when this came out, and they again looked at each other again, and they just smiled, and the tears were rolled down my cheeks again. But this time, when the tears stopped rolling and I felt like I'd come clean, I just felt better. When I'd only gotten halfway through the repentance process, should we say, I didn't feel that good. There's no warm feeling that came over me because I was still being deceitful. I hadn't come clean. As soon as I came clean, I got the warm feeling. So I had another story I was going to tell, but guess what? The time has run out, so you won't hear that story this time. But I hope maybe that little story with the 3 dead chickens and the lessons that I learned from that had some carryover value later in my life and helped me get out of some other tight spots that I managed to get myself into. It played a part. That's why I say even bad things can accomplish good purposes if they're taken with the right perspective. If you look at them like, okay, why me? No. What can I learn from this that will help me going forward? Well, I can't say that I stopped and taught myself that lesson right there, but inwardly the lesson had been taught and was being taught and would be taught over the next weeks and months and years and decades, and is continuing even today. I've told you that I'm not a perfect person by any means. I've got problems that need to be overcome. And I'll tell you about how that process is going maybe some other time too, because I can't right now. But I tell you all this because I'm trying to get you in a situation where you'll recall what I've said and it will save you some grief. I don't want you to carry a burden that you don't have to carry. And I don't want you to get yourself into a situation where you carry a burden that you don't have to carry and then realize that the one that told you that this was going to be a fun activity jumped out the window and ran. Not my cousin I'm talking about. I'm talking about Satan himself, the adversary, the need for opposition in things so that we could grow. And I used that opposition in this instance to help me grow as I went through life. And now here I am, well, not 75 years later, but I wasn't very old at the time. I wasn't very old. So it served me for a lot of years, and I hope it has some service to you too, because I don't want you to be unhappy when you don't have to be, because I love you. Bye.